In word, don't let the sun go down on you and insert name of town. This is a quote by American author and sociologist James Lowen. According to him, this sentence would be commonly found on signs when entering a sundown town, a town that through various means attempted to exclude African Americans and other minorities from living there. This dark part of history is oft forgotten, yet these towns have affected minorities across the nation whose effects can still be felt today. When we forget history, we are doomed to repeat it. From beginnings to its modern effects, sundown towns remain to be a deeply sad part of American history. I've been interested in this subject for a long time, but this is the first time I've felt the full breadth of it. Excuse me. I have studied the limited amount of research done on this subject in preparation for this speech. First, I will discuss the history of sundown towns and how sundown towns came to be, then how they were enforced, and finally the modern effects of these towns. But first, what is a sundown town? According to the American Black Holocaust Museum, or ABH Museum, a sundown town is a community that for decades kept non-whites from living in it, and thus was all white on purpose. However, the term sundown town is not limited only to a town. Rather, it is a blanket term that can mean a city or entire county or individual suburbs. Such towns began cropping up around 1890 and ended as late as the 1960s, according to James Lowen in his book, Sundown Towns, A Hidden Dimension of American Racism. Speaking of, sundown towns began as the byproduct of the migration of recently freed slaves. Former slaves moved north en masse from their former homes. For example, according to the ABH Museum, after this great migration had settled, every county in Montana had an African family in it. Before the Great Migration, it was remarkable for a large city in the north to not have any Africans in it. According to Lowen, referencing a newspaper article from Wyandotte, Michigan. But in the decades to come, cities like Wyandotte would fight to keep their town exclusive to whites. Sundown towns are not a rare occurrence as one might think or hope. They are actually a widespread, commonplace occurrence in this time. But first, I'd like to clarify how a sundown town is identified. In a procedure developed by James Lowen outlined in his article on the website Teaching Tolerance, the first place to look is census research within the time frame of about 1860 to present day. Within the census data, one can look for any suspicious drop-off in any minority population. One might assume that these towns would largely be localized to the Deep South, where Jim Crow laws were commonplace, but oddly enough, according to the ABH Museum, they were a rarity by comparison. In Mississippi, there are no more than 6 sundown towns, which pales in comparison to a place like Illinois, which had 456 sundown towns. In fact, here we see a map of Wisconsin, where every highlighted town name is a town that's been confirmed to historically be a sundown town. As I mentioned before, after the Great Migration of former slaves beginning around 1865, every county in Montana had an African family in it. By 1930, 11 had no African families in it, and the rest had a dwindling population. Now, we have covered how these towns came to be. I am now going to cover the means in which these communities used to exclude minorities. There was a variety of ways that minorities were kept out of these towns. The most obvious ways that towns would keep out minorities was through blatant advertising. As I mentioned earlier, some towns would post signs warning minorities of the dangers of being within city limits after dark. In the article Sundown Towns, Midwest Confronts Its Complicated Racial Legacy by Jack Schuler, he states, quote, "In some cases, such as Goshen, town brochures boasted of a no Negro population as recent as 1955. Here, we see a brochure for the town of Mena, Arkansas, where here we see it says, "No mosquitoes, no droughts, no Negroes." Another more frequent way that cities would keep out minorities was through passing laws and through legal documents such as ordinances and deeds. In Seattle, historically a sundown town, a deed sold to a Mr. and Mrs. Williams in 1916 contained the following clause. It said, "The lot nor any part thereof shall not be sold to any persons either of whole or part blood of Mongolian, Malay, or Ethiopian races, nor shall the same person nor any part thereof be rented to such person to persons of such races." According to James Lowen in his Teaching Tolerance article, the town of Keelenworth, Illinois' founder James Sears built into the founding ordinances of the city such exclusionary steps as the quote, "sales to Caucasians only." Another instance in Keelenworth is an African-American family having a burning cross being placed on their lawn. This leads me to the final way that towns would keep out minorities, through violence and intimidation. Brutal violence was sadly a commonplace tool for these sundown towns. According to Lowen, in 1950, Vienna, Illinois had an African population of 1,085. But after two black men allegedly beat up a grandmother and allegedly attempted to rape the granddaughter, the sheriff, quote, deputized every white man in town. After apprehending the two men, they sacked the entire African community of Vienna. According to a local journalist interviewed by Lowen, quote, blacks were running for their lives. By 2000, Vienna had an African population of 1. According to the ABH Museum, 16 other towns in Illinois alone have used race riots to drive out minorities. Now that we understand how these towns enforced these town goals, I'd like to talk about the repercussions of sundown towns. These towns continue to affect the African American community in America to this day. These former sundown towns, while not having ordinances or signs, still carried the reputation of a place for African Americans to avoid. According to Lowen, in Florida, any town that has a palm in its name is known for African Americans to avoid, as does in Texas with any towns with white in their name, any towns in Indiana that have any color in their name. To this day, those places have had historically low African populations due to their sundown past. Many leaders of America grew up in sundown towns. For example, Presidents George W. Bush grew up in Highland Park, a sundown suburb of Dallas, which didn't have a black homeowner until 2003, as did Lyndon Johnson in Johnson City. Another byproduct of sundown towns was a distinct wealth gap in the towns that practiced this exclusion. According to the ABH Museum, most average Americans transfer their wealth to their offspring through their property. But since African Americans and other minorities were not allowed to own property in valuable neighborhoods, refer to the deed from Seattle that I brought up earlier, they were not able to give their children the opportunities that the white families were able to. This exclusion and segregation led to the forming of ghettos, where, according to Lowen, it makes it easier to discriminate African Americans and other minorities, in schooling all the way to housing. Here, we see a map of Seattle, a former sundown town in 1960. There was a clear cluster of black residences forming a ghetto. Today, I have discussed how sundown towns came to be. Then I told you some of the means that people would use to keep minorities out, and finally, how sundown towns affect us today. From the beginning to its modern effects, sundown town remains to be a deeply sad, unknown past of America. In conclusion, sundown towns are a dark mark on American culture. And despite the fact that we no longer see signs with racial epithets on them, we still feel the marks of them today. Thank you.